One final and essential element of the journey into the afterlife emerged during the period following the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Like the coffin texts, magical artifacts, and figurines representing servants, the notion of a final judgment embodied the blend of hope and anxiety that colored ancient Egyptian views on life after death. More than perhaps any other aspect of their religious belief system, the concept of a final, unavoidable judgment by a divine authority left a lasting imprint on pharaonic theology. Unlike physical items such as hedgehogs, hippos, or shabdas, the idea of a last judgment transcended Egyptian religion and influenced other faiths across the Near East, Christianity among them. In the Book of Two Ways, the imagined geography of the afterlife began at the Island of Fire. There, the wicked were destroyed by flames, while the righteous were granted refreshing water to aid them on their difficult journey through the underworld. Though the idea of being tested by fire is ancient, this basic form of judgment was eventually reshaped by evolving societal values. As Egypt underwent periods of instability, new spiritual concepts took root. Death came to be seen not simply as a transition to a different realm, but as a potential endpoint. The possibility of rebirth, as a divine being, or annihilation through a second death came to depend on a person's behavior during their lifetime. A literary work known as the Instruction for King Merakara, said to be authored by a king of Heracleopolis, captured this emerging belief. When a man endures after death, his deeds remain with him. He who enters the next world free of wrongdoing will exist there like a god. Within this framework, it was no longer enough to be virtuous. Inscriptions from this era reflect a noticeable shift in tone. Where earlier autobiographies from the Old Kingdom were filled with self-praise, now there appeared a sense of humility and caution. A man might list his accomplishments while also insisting, "I never spoke falsely against anyone." The practice of the negative confession became central to the judgment ritual. Still, denial alone was not sufficient. Divine justice demanded a full evaluation of a person's moral character, a balancing of their virtues and transgressions to reach a fair verdict. Only those who passed this moral reckoning were permitted to join Osiris and attain eternal life. On his stela at Abydos, General in Tef of the 11th Dynasty boldly stated that his voice is true in the calculation of differences. From these early expressions, the concept of judgment grew rapidly into a foundational belief within Egyptian funerary practices. Eventually, the phrase "true of voice" became the standard euphemism for the deceased. Given Egypt's strong culture of administration and record-keeping, it is unsurprising that theologians envisioned this judgment as taking place on an immense set of scales, like those used by goldsmiths. These scales symbolize divine precision and impartiality. One spell from the coffin text refers to this balance as that balance of Ra on which Mot is lifted, signifying that the process was sanctioned by Ra, god of the sun and creation, and that a person's actions would be weighed against Mot, the embodiment of truth. This final judgment allowed no room for deceit. The result of the process was imagined as a division of the dead into two groups, the vindicated and the condemned, a sorting of souls into the justified and the damned. The destinies awaiting each group were clearly defined. With eternal existence hanging in the balance at the final judgment, the Egyptians' vivid imagination sprang into overdrive. They envisioned not only new challenges in the afterlife but also crafted ways to overcome them, a process that seemed to empower them to confront the uncertainties of death with greater courage. One of the greatest threats during the judgment before the divine tribunal was the possibility that a person's own heart might betray its owner by revealing damaging truths or falsehoods, ultimately swaying the judgment toward condemnation. To guard against this terrifying prospect, the Egyptians turned to powerful magic. They needed a way to ensure that the heart would remain silent at the crucial moment. Their solution was the creation of a special amulet, introduced during the late Middle Kingdom. Modeled after the scarab beetle, this particular amulet was distinct. It featured a human head and was inscribed with a spell intended to instruct and protect the heart. Once the body was mummified, the scarab was placed directly over the heart, and its incantation delivered clear guidance. Do not rise up to oppose me. Do not testify against me. Do not stand against me in the tribunal. Do not lean toward my condemnation. Over time, The heart came to symbolize the entire person and their life's actions. The image of the heart being weighed against the feather of truth became central in funerary papyri, visually representing the decisive moment of judgment. This scene remains one of the most iconic and emotionally powerful illustrations in all of ancient Egyptian art. Remarkably, the idea of a terrible day of judgment, when all hearts will reveal their secrets, has endured for over 4 millennia, continuing to resonate in spiritual traditions to this day. Mentuhotep, the victor of the civil war and unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, was celebrated by later Egyptians as a foundational figure, comparable to Menes, the legendary first ruler of the First Dynasty. However, destiny did not favor his descendants for long. After 2 short and unremarkable reigns by successors also named Mentuhotep, the royal lineage of the Theban 11th dynasty came to an end. In its place, a new dynasty rose to claim the throne and assume the authority of kingship. The 12th dynasty, spanning from 1938 to 1755 BC, became the most stable royal house in Egypt's ancient history. Over 180 years, 8 rulers across 7 generations of a single bloodline governed the United Lands. Under their strong leadership, Egypt flourished both economically and culturally. This era became the pinnacle of classical Egyptian literature, during which many enduring works were created. Artisans achieved exceptional levels of skill, producing some of the finest jewelry that has ever survived from antiquity. Egypt's influence extended farther than ever before, reaching into the Aegean, Cyprus, Anatolia, the Red Sea coastline, and Nubia. Most importantly, the Nile Valley and Delta were reorganized into a single, efficient, centrally governed nation. While this portrayal of the 12th dynasty is factually correct, it misses one key dimension: the emotional and social atmosphere of the time. The literature from the period reveals a more troubled mood, dwelling on themes of despair, unrest, and political violence. Works such as The Dispute Between a Man and His Soul, The Admonitions of Epure, and The Instruction of Amenemhat I for his sons speak of exhaustion with life, national turmoil, and even royal assassination. The image of a glowing, peaceful Middle Kingdom stands in stark contrast to the writings of the time and to the internal political realities. From its beginning, the 12th dynasty aimed to fundamentally reshape Egypt's governance and social structure. The dynasty pursued a vision of perfect order built on strict administration and the elimination of opposition. The rulers of this era governed with a cold efficiency reminiscent of Old Kingdom practices. Their quest for internal stability led them to surpass all earlier kings in their use of control. They combined powerful propaganda with force, persuasion with fear. Beneath the brilliant surface of cultural achievements, more ominous currents were flowing. The dominant tone of the 12th dynasty was set from the very beginning. Since the dynasty's founder came from a non-royal background, it is unsurprising that the official records omit any details about how he ascended to power. Still, there are subtle clues that suggest what likely transpired. The final ruler of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep IV, although sharing a name with the great unifier, lacked the strength and leadership qualities of his namesake. He inherited a strong Theban perspective but did not share the expansive ambitions of his predecessor. With a provincial mindset and no significant architectural achievements, his short reign's most notable act was organizing a quarrying expedition to Wadi Hammamat's Black Mountains, to secure a stone for his sarcophagus. The expedition was commemorated with 4 inscriptions carved into the quarry face. Though they offered the expected reverence to the king and wished him countless jubilees, they credited the mission's success not to the king, but to its actual leader, a powerful official named Amenemhat. He is described with a string of prestigious titles: member of the elite, high official, overseer of the city, vizier, overseer of officials, lord of judgment, overseer of everything in the entire land. The next time Amenemhat appears in the historical record, he is no longer a vizier but a king. Although the specific events marking his rise to power remain undocumented, it is widely believed that Amenemhat I seized the throne, capitalizing on his unparalleled influence at court when the opportunity presented itself. Evidence suggests that the transition of power did not occur peacefully, but rather through a violent coup during a time of national instability. Inscriptions discovered at a quarry in Hatnub, located in Middle Egypt, vividly describe the turmoil during Amenemhat I's reign, 1938 to 1908 BC. These texts, attributed to the local governor Neri, are dated not by the king's regnal years, but by Neri's own time in office. The inscriptions speak of rebellion, famine, looting, foreign incursions, and civil discord. Strikingly, the palace itself is identified as the epicenter of the chaos. I saved my town on the day of conflict from the dreadful fear caused by the royal house. This may be the most damning allusion to oppressive rule in Egypt's history. Amenemhat I's chosen Horus name, he who pacifies the heart of the two lands, was no mere formality. It carried an implicit warning. His campaign of pacification extended beyond the Nile Valley, reaching into the depths of the Sahara. K, a seasoned hunter and overseer of the western desert, was dispatched to lead a mission aimed at tracking and capturing fugitives fleeing the regime. His funerary stela records, I reached the western oasis, examined all its paths, and brought back those I found hiding there. Under Amenemhat I, there was no refuge for dissidents. However, resistance proved difficult to fully extinguish. The king encountered threats from various directions, including uprisings along both banks of the Nile. One funerary stela mentions a river-based military campaign and a surprise assault on a docking area. Similarly, an inscription in the tomb of Amenemhat I, a regional governor at Beni Hassan, recounts the same operation. I sailed south with His Majesty in 20 cedar ships. Then he returned, rejoicing, for he had expelled the enemy from both banks. The rebel remains unnamed, but he was almost certainly a domestic rival, possibly the last ruler of the 11th Dynasty, or one of his supporters. Scenes from Amenemhat's tomb and those of his successors depict Egyptians fighting fellow Egyptians in brutal urban battles. Ultimately, the king's forces prevailed, and Amenemhat I wasted no time in consolidating power. He placed trusted allies in positions of authority. Amenemhat, for instance, was appointed mayor of Menat Khufu, while other local governors in Middle Egypt were dismissed and replaced with loyalists indebted to the new order. Egypt's new ruler was methodically tightening his control over the state apparatus. Buoyed by his success in quelling internal unrest, the king turned his attention to restoring the prestige of the monarchy. Throughout Egypt's long history, the ruler's two most vital responsibilities had been to maintain order and honor the gods. Having secured the former, Amenemhat I now focused on the latter. He ordered the construction of a grand temple dedicated to his favored deity, the Theban god Ammonius, fitting, as his own name meant Ammonius is at the forefront. Nothing less than the most magnificent temple in Egypt would be appropriate. Prior to the 12th Dynasty, Egyptian temples were modest in scale. The most awe-inspiring buildings were the pyramids of kings, not temples to the gods. Amenemhat changed this by initiating the tradition of grand temples built for Egypt's major deities. Although little remains today of the Middle Kingdom temple to Ammonius at Ipitsut, it must have dominated the surrounding city and projected an unmistakable image of royal authority. The structure measured more than 330 feet in length and 214 feet in width, encircled by two massive boundary walls. Within this enclosure stood the sanctuary, fronted by an impressive stone terrace and surrounded by a complex of corridors and storage rooms. In contrast to the small, provincial temples of the Old Kingdom, it was monumental. It also signaled a new era. Amenemhat I and his successors would prove tireless in their pursuit of state-sponsored construction, using architecture to give physical form to their vision of national order. Although building on a grand scale had long been part of Egyptian tradition, Amenemhat took this ambition even further with a project more ambitious than even his temple to Ammonius. Midway through his reign, he initiated the founding of an entirely new capital city. One of the main flaws of the 11th dynasty had been its narrow concentration on Thebes and its surroundings. To effectively govern the length of Egypt, a more central location was required, and that is exactly where the new capital would rise. The city's name reflected the king's firm grip on power, Amenemhat II, meaning Amenemhat seizes the two lands. It was a bold declaration, signaling both how he had taken the throne and how he intended to maintain control. To commemorate this new beginning, Amenemhat adopted a new Horus name. No longer emphasizing pacifying the heart of the two lands, his new title proclaimed the dawn of a national revival. He envisioned Egypt reborn, its culture renewed, and the institution of kingship restored to its former glory. If the goal was to rekindle the heights of the Pyramid Age, then constructing a fitting royal tomb was a logical starting point. For the first time in 200 years, an order was issued from the palace to Egypt's architects, masons, and artisans: the king would have a pyramid. And not just any pyramid. Modeled after the monuments of the Sixth Dynasty, the pyramid of Amenemhat I began to rise on the desert plateau near his new capital. It was unlike anything constructed in centuries. To reinforce its symbolic power and legitimacy, the king even commanded that stones from the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza be transported and integrated into the core of his own pyramid. To modern eyes, dismantling part of such a legendary structure might seem sacrilegious, but in Amenemhat's mind, it was a vital part of restoring Egypt's greatness. His successors in the 12th dynasty would follow this example, each building their own pyramid as a testament to the dynasty's legacy. It is no wonder that Amenemhat could proudly proclaim, "Kingship has once again become what it used to be." Having subdued domestic unrest, paid homage to the gods, and initiated the construction of his pyramid, Amenemhat I may have felt that the rebirth of Egyptian civilization was well underway. However, the invasions from Palestine and Nubia during the First Intermediate Period had left Egypt with a hard-learned lesson. Its neighbors to the north and south coveted the rich lands along the Nile. Sustaining Egypt's prosperity would require more than internal order. Recognizing the threat, Amenemhat shifted his focus to fortifying the borders. His strategic approach would shape Egyptian policy for the next 150 years. The country was transformed into a bastion. Egypt's northeastern frontier, particularly the fringes of the delta, posed a significant challenge. The region's marshy landscape, intersected by waterways and canals, made it difficult to enforce a fixed boundary or maintain strict oversight of migration from the struggling territories of Palestine. In response, the king ordered the establishment of a chain of fortified outposts along the borderlands. These garrisons were placed within signaling distance of one another to allow for rapid communication. Patrols were regularly sent out from each post to monitor border traffic. This network was designed to prevent major incursions and gather intelligence on any suspicious activity. The 12th dynasty's emphasis on surveillance as a tool of control was central to its broader security doctrine. On Egypt's southern border, a different challenge emerged. The boundary with Nubia required a distinct solution. Since the days of Hyksos in the 6th dynasty, it had been evident that the people of Wawat, Lower Nubia, living closest to Egypt, were asserting their independence and forming their own political entities, directly opposing Egyptian influence. The collapse of the Old Kingdom and the chaos that followed only accelerated this trend. The Theban military's reliance on Nubian mercenaries may have further emboldened Nubian identity and ambitions. By the end of the 11th dynasty, Egypt's control over Wawat had eroded significantly. Worse still, local Nubian leaders began adopting Egyptian royal titles, directly challenging the king's authority. One such figure, styling himself as the Horus Ankhnumra, the king Wajkara, the son of Ra Sedrosini, even referred to the Egyptians as the enemies, a shocking inversion of traditional Egyptian rhetoric. Another went so far as to name himself King Intef, evoking the great Theban rulers of old, and left behind 15 inscriptions carved into prominent rock faces throughout his territory. This provocation could not be ignored. Numerous inscriptions from Egyptian campaigns in the same region reveal a flurry of activity during the early years of Amenemhat I's reign. While the king was consolidating power at home, his agents were operating in Lower Nubia, conducting reconnaissance, and laying the groundwork for a decisive military strike. After 2 decades of preparation and stabilization within Egypt, the king's forces recaptured the key site of Buhan, located at the base of the second cataract of the Nile. It was quickly transformed into a fortified outpost, serving as a launch point for further military operations. By the 29th year of Amenemhat I's rule, all was in place. A campaign was launched under the leadership of his trusted vizier Intifikar, tasked with crushing Wawat. Determined to eliminate any trace of Nubian resistance and reassert full Egyptian control over the region, Indefeker carried out the mission with ruthless efficiency. He later proclaimed, "I destroyed all the remaining Nubians of Wawat. I sailed upstream in triumph, killing them on their own land. I sailed downstream, destroying crops and cutting down the last trees. I set their homes ablaze, as one would with rebels against the king." This scorched earth policy served a dual purpose: to punish the people of Wawat and to send a warning to any other regions considering revolt. For the Nubians who stood helpless on the banks of the Nile, watching as their land was laid waste and their homes turned to ashes, the consequences were dire. Before the devastation began, Indefeker recorded the construction of an enclosed compound. In reality, it was a facility for processing individuals conscripted into forced labor. The future awaiting the conquered population of Wawat was one of servitude. They and their descendants would be made to labor in their own homeland, now under the firm grip of Egyptian rule. Heavy lies the crown, especially when it has been seized through force rather than inherited by rightful succession. Amenemhat I, the founder of a new dynasty and a self-styled architect of Egypt's revival, was well aware of his common origins and the residual hostility that lingered in parts of the country. His foremost concern was to secure his family's grip on power and ensure a stable transition of rule. In a move that was highly unusual, if not entirely unprecedented, he had his son and designated successor crowned during his own lifetime. Prince Senusret was named co-regent near the end of Amenemhat's second decade on the throne, around 1918 BC, and the two ruled Egypt side by side for another 10 years. A few monuments record this dual rule, though it appears that Amenemhat allowed most official inscriptions to be dated to his son's reign. This practice of co-regency became a defining feature of Twelfth Dynasty succession. It served its intended purpose well until the dynasty eventually declined, about 150 years later. Yet even this carefully crafted arrangement could not shield Amenemhat I from the dangers that surrounded him. Having risen to power through force, he ultimately fell victim to violence. A striking and singular text composed after his death has the deceased king recounting the tale of his assassination to his son. "It was after supper, once darkness had settled. I was resting on my bed, weary, my mind beginning to wander, when the very weapons meant to protect me were turned against me. I was like a desert serpent. I woke to the sound of fighting, and saw that it was my own guards preparing to strike. Had I seized my weapons at that moment, I might have driven them back, but no one is brave in the dark, and no man can fight alone." Thus ended the life of the first autocrat of the 12th dynasty. But his assassins had miscalculated fatally. Senusret I assumed full control without delay, continuing his father's policies but with a new approach. Where outright oppression had provoked resistance, subtler tactics would be employed to win over minds and hearts. Commissioning a literary work that addressed the assassination of his father was a bold, almost subversive act on Senusret's part. It directly challenged the ideology of divine kingship and broke a powerful taboo against acknowledging crises in public. Yet Senusret and his advisors were shrewd. They understood that there was greater political gain in openly confronting the murder than in concealing it. During the Civil War, provincial leaders like Anktifi had used stories of chaos to validate their own authority. Now, the political ideas born in the turmoil of the First Intermediate Period were being retooled as ideological foundations for the 12th dynasty. By crafting a narrative around Amenemhat's murder and presenting it to the royal court, Senusret gave himself justification for a firm crackdown. His father became a martyred king, he himself, the loyal successor, avenging the crown. Prior to this period, Egypt had produced little that could be called literature. Its pragmatic culture had little interest in purely artistic expression. But Senusret understood that poets and writers could be just as powerful as generals. The literary blossoming that took place during the 12th dynasty stands as one of the Middle Kingdom's greatest cultural triumphs. Many of the works written for the royal court became enduring classics. They explored profound themes and deep emotions, all in service to the monarchy. Even early in his reign, Amenemhat I had recognized the power of literature as propaganda. In the prophecies of Neferti, He cast himself as Egypt's savior and restorer of divine order after a time of chaos and decline. A king will come from the south. Ameni, the Justified, is his name. Then order will be restored to its place, and chaos will be expelled. Senusret I's literary circle perfected their craft with the creation of the outstanding masterpiece of ancient Egyptian literature, the Tale of Sinu. This fictional narrative tells the story of a courtier who flees Egypt after learning of Amenemhat I's assassination. In exile, Sinu finds refuge at the court of a Palestinian ruler, where he gains wealth and fame. Yet, as he nears the end of his life, his deepest desire is to return to Egypt, to reconnect with all it represents, and to reconcile with the king, the country's ultimate symbol. May the king of Egypt be pleased with me, so I may live according to his will. May I honor the mistress of the land residing in his palace, and obey the commands of her children. Then my strength will be renewed. The enduring popularity of Sinu, which was read and reread for centuries after its creation, owes much to its literary brilliance, engaging storytelling, and emotional depth. Yet beneath these qualities runs a subtle but persistent theme of loyalty to the monarch, intricately woven throughout the narrative. As both a literary work and a piece of political propaganda, Sinu stands as a prime example. A more direct piece of political writing, the Loyalist Instruction, presented loyalty to the king as the fundamental rule for righteous living, urging all Egyptians to worship the king within your bodies. Hold goodwill toward his majesty in your minds. Fear him daily. Celebrate him every moment. And in case anyone missed the point, there was a stark reminder of the ever-watchful surveillance state. He sees what lies in the heart. His eyes search through every person. Despite this barrage of textual commands to support the monarchy, political unrest that had troubled Egypt during Amenemhat I's reign resurfaced. Another expedition was sent into the western desert to secure the land of the oasis dwellers, while within the Nile Valley itself, temples at Jerdi, modern Tad, and Abu in southern Egypt were plundered and destroyed. Though these acts of desecration were attributed to foreign groups such as Asiatics and Nubians, it is likely that local insurgents had either instigated or supported the unrest. The king's forces eventually restored order. The rebels were captured and executed in brutal fashion, burned alive as a warning. Following this, Senusret I deliberately invested heavily in local temples across the 7 southernmost provinces of Egypt. Among his notable constructions was a splendid Jubilee pavilion for the Temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut. Its delicate limestone reliefs depict the king and the god embracing, symbolizing the regime's claimed legitimacy. Yet alongside this exalted imagery, the pavilion also reflects the Middle Kingdom's preoccupation with administration. Along its base, the 42 provinces of Egypt are listed, each represented by a deity, and the size of each province is indicated in units of river length. Thus, a decorative scheme designed to display the king's all-encompassing authority also incorporated the kind of detailed statistics favored by bureaucrats. The efficient administrative systems perfected in provincial centers throughout Egypt also proved essential in governing Egyptian-controlled Lower Nubia. The campaign to retake Wawat, undertaken 9 years into the co-regency of Amenemhat I and Senusret I, around 1909 BC, laid the groundwork for formally annexing Nubia as far south as the Second Cataract. Egypt demonstrated its dominance through grand state construction projects, building fortresses to solidify control over the local population. These fortifications, spaced along the river between the First and Second Cataracts, were designed to withstand surprise attacks and prolonged sieges. Each fortress featured massive rectangular mud brick walls reinforced by external towers at the corners and along the sides. The landward wall was protected by a deep ditch, while the inner side featured a low parapet with semicircular bastions and downward-facing arrow slits for archers, providing a second line of defense. Overall, these Nubian forts represented impressive feats of military engineering and must have made a powerful impression on the indigenous inhabitants living nearby in small mud villages. With garrisons stationed in these nearly impregnable bases guarding key points along the river, Egypt secured long-term control over Wawat. In Senusret's 18th year as king, his army launched another campaign reaching as far as the Third Cataract. The general in command, Mentuhotep, proudly declared that he had pacified the southerners. By the conclusion of Senusret I's lengthy reign, which lasted nearly 50 years, the early challenges of the dynasty had faded into the past. Egypt, along with Lower Nubia, was firmly under centralized rule. The central government benefited immensely from the flow of gold, copper, and precious stones extracted from the conquered region of Wawat. These materials were delivered to royal workshops, where skilled artisans transformed them into exquisite jewelry, sculptures, and decorative objects. These creations not only adorned the royal court and enhanced the monarch's prestige, but also contributed to the state's wealth through the export of luxury items and long-distance trade. Egypt's international affairs extended beyond commerce. With domestic stability secured, the country began asserting itself militarily to protect economic interests and ensure continued access to essential resources. This dual strategy of diplomacy and force became particularly evident during the reign of Senusret I's successor, Amenemhat II. During restoration work at the Temple of Jurti near Thebes, archaeologists uncovered 4 copper chests hidden in the foundation. Each bore the name of Amenemhat II, and together they contained a stunning collection of treasures, beads, seals, and rough-cut lapis lazuli, silver ingots, chains, a model lion, and drinking vessels, along with ingots and containers made of pure gold. This hoard ranks among the most remarkable archaeological finds in the Nile Valley. Even more fascinating than the treasure itself were the trade networks it reflected. The lapis lazuli originated from Mesopotamia and the distant mines of Badakhshan, while the silver cups, in Minoan style, likely came from Crete or a Minoan trading enclave in Syria. A more recent discovery further highlights Egypt's outward-looking policies during the mid-12th dynasty. A stone block found in Memphis contains excerpts from the Annals of Amenemhat II, offering a detailed record of royal activities in the early years of his rule. Among the expected references to religious ceremonies and the installation of cult statues, several surprising entries detail military expeditions to faraway lands. One such entry states, "An expedition was sent alongside the overseer of infantry to devastate Asia, resulting in substantial loot including silver, gold, livestock, and Asiatic slaves." Another campaign in Lebanon brought back similar spoils, along with valuable conifer wood and aromatic oils. Perhaps most intriguing is the record of a mission in which infantry forces returned after attacking the lands of Iwa and Iaz. These regions contributed bronze, malachite, timber, and slaves as tribute. While the exact location of Iwa is uncertain, it may correspond to Ura, a site on the southeastern coast of present-day Turkey. If this identification is correct, it would mark the only known instance of an Egyptian military incursion into Asia Minor during this period. Iaz is even more mysterious. Given its production of 2 copper-based resources and the form of its name, it is likely that Iaz refers to Cyprus. Under Amenemhat II, Egypt had already established itself as a significant force in the geopolitics of the eastern Mediterranean. According to historical records, the expeditions abroad brought back thousands of slaves. These individuals were forcibly relocated to the Nile Valley, where they were employed on royal estates and drafted into state construction projects. This mass resettlement significantly altered the ethnic composition of Egypt's population and set in motion long-term effects that could not have been anticipated. A particularly large group of Asiatic captives was settled in the newly established town of Kahan. Built by Senusret II, successor to Amenemhat II, Kahan was designed to accommodate the workers associated with his nearby pyramid complex. The town's layout reflected a high level of centralized planning. With its rigid grid pattern, designated zones for different functions, and clearly separated residential areas based on social status, Kahan embodied the 12th Dynasty's ideal of a meticulously ordered society. Enclosed within a large rectangular wall, the town was split into 2 unequal parts. In the larger, more spacious section, high-ranking officials resided in expansive villas, located conveniently close to the administrative hub. In contrast, the smaller sector consisted of rows of modest, barrack-style houses crammed into narrow alleys. These housed the laborers who supported the town's infrastructure. The urban design made a stark and literal statement about social divisions, reflecting the hierarchical mindset deeply embedded in Egyptian bureaucracy. Kahan, much like the settlements in occupied Wawat, included facilities designed to confine and control the population. Compounds meant for detaining people were an integral part of the apparatus of state power. In fact, the policies applied by the 12th Dynasty in Egypt mirrored those used in subjugated Nubia, offering a clear window into the ruler's worldview. All resources were to be used in service of the crown. People were treated as movable assets, deployed wherever the state required. Just as manufacturing activities such as baking, brewing, and crafting were best carried out in regimented, uniform workshops, so too was the labor force housed in uniform, controlled environments. Across Egypt, from the Delta to Upper Egypt, 12th Dynasty settlements consistently exhibit this same highly regulated layout. Often established on undeveloped land, these towns likely involved the forced relocation of entire communities. This authoritarian model of kingship reached its peak during the reign of Senusret III, the most well-documented ruler of his dynasty. Under his firm control, every element of 12th Dynasty governance came together in a unified strategy: propagandist literature, centralized administration, meticulous state planning, military expansion and occupation in Nubia, and a new artistic medium for expressing royal authority. Senusret III's use of propaganda began with the written and spoken word. His poets and scribes crafted grandiose praises, celebrating his virtues in elaborate compositions. One of the most striking examples is the cycle of hymns, likely meant to be recited during royal appearances or in front of his statues. Egypt rejoices in your mighty arm. You have preserved its traditions. The common folk rejoice in your guidance. Your strength has secured their prosperity. The two banks rejoice in your fearsome presence. You have expanded their wealth. Your young soldiers rejoice. You have ensured their success. Your honored elders rejoice. You have restored their vigor. And the verses continue, echoing the same exaltations. A more nuanced approach appeared in two major literary works of pessimistic tone, the Complaints of Kakaparsinab and the Admonitions of Epure. Like the earlier prophecies of Neferti, these texts painted a vivid image of chaos and social breakdown, implicitly justifying strong and centralized rule as both necessary and beneficial. These compositions resonated with the deeply ingrained Egyptian worldview. Egyptians saw existence as a constant struggle between order and disorder, and these literary works reinforced the need for a firm hand to maintain balance. They were designed to influence the literate elite surrounding the throne, who seemed to yield under the pressure of relentless ideological messaging. Once he had subdued the intellectual and bureaucratic elite, Senusret III turned his focus to the powerful provincial governors. While it was theoretically within the king's rights to dismiss these nomarchs or simply not appoint successors, Senusret chose a more strategic path. Rather than risk igniting fresh dissent, he employed a more subtle, calculated approach. He weakened the governors by promoting them. By offering prestigious and profitable positions at the royal court, he drew figures like Amenemhat III of Beni Hassan away from their local power bases and into the heart of the state apparatus. With their attention shifted to the royal center, local governance was re-centralized under direct control. Within a single generation, the role of nomarch vanished from Egyptian politics. Once absorbed into court life, these officials were fully brought under royal control. The king provided their tombs, laid out in orderly rows within the royal necropolis, symbolizing their complete assimilation into the centralized structure he had so effectively crafted. The 12th Dynasty's intense commitment to strict organization found one of its clearest expressions in the two grandest construction projects of Senusret III's rule. The first was his pyramid town, a purpose-built settlement created for the workers building his pyramid at the sacred city of Abydos. As with Kahan, the layout followed a precise geometric plan. Homes were constructed from identical mud bricks, arranged in blocks measuring 100 cubits across, and divided by streets 5 cubits wide. Predictably, the upper classes were granted the most desirable plots while the rest of the population was crowded into smaller dwellings in less favorable areas. The settlement was officially called Wasuti Kakura Masai Abydos, meaning enduring are the places of Kakura, Senusret III's throne name, the justified, in Abydos. For everyday use, the locals wisely shortened it to Ysut. Senusret III's most intense and strategic effort, however, was concentrated in Nubia. His objectives were threefold: to reinforce Egyptian dominance over Wawat and establish a lasting frontier, to regulate the flow of goods between Upper Nubia and Egypt to enrich the royal treasury, and to counter the growing threat posed by the powerful kingdom of Kush, centered at Kerma beyond the Third Cataract. To achieve these goals, he launched a bold initiative. Though designed to function as a coordinated defensive system, each fortress served a distinct purpose. Kor, located on a Nile island, acted as a military palace and operational headquarters for the king during campaigns. Aken became the primary trading hub, positioned well within Egyptian-controlled lands. Ascot, ominously named Destroying the Nubians, was the most heavily fortified. While its central function was to store grain, it also oversaw forced labor across the gold-rich regions of the Second Cataract. Despite nearby indigenous settlements, the fort was staffed and supplied from Egypt, emphasizing centralized control. Shalfak, known as Subduing the Foreign Lands, served as a launch point for patrols dispatched into the surrounding desert to track the movement of goods and people. Urinardi, bearing the name Repelling the Tribesmen, operated as the command center for local garrisons and also provided another royal residence for the king during military operations. One notable feature of all these forts was their clever integration with the natural landscape to maximize defense. Defensive walls traced the contours of rocky ridges, high battlements were constructed atop cliffs, and covered stairways led to the river, ensuring access to water even during sieges. Further south of Urinardi lay the most critical cluster of forts, strategically guarding the narrow passage of the Semna Gorge. On the eastern side, the fortress of Kama, opposing the bowmen, kept watch over the river and prevented incursions from the eastern desert. Directly across the river stood the central stronghold of Semna, formerly titled Powerful as Kakura, the Justified. With its expansive barracks, Semna was poised to block the gorge and defend Egypt from threats coming from Kush. It maintained a permanent force of 400 to 500 soldiers, and in times of need, its commander could summon reinforcements from neighboring forts like Urinardi, Aken, and Buhan via a network of signal beacons placed within visual range of one another. During peacetime, the primary responsibility of the Semna garrison was to regulate traffic along this stretch of the Nile. Boats docked at the lower basin of the fort, where goods were either transferred onto Egyptian ships or loaded onto donkey caravans headed for Aken. A secondary outpost, Semna South, functioned as a checkpoint where local caravans awaited approval to proceed. It also served as a lookout, monitoring the flow of people and ships approaching the gorge. The network of forts built across the Second Cataract stood as a striking testament to Egypt's military strength and administrative control. It's little surprise that Senusret III came to be worshipped as a deity in Wawat, or that Greek historians later referred to him as Hyksos, using their version of his name. Equally critical to these forts was the surveillance system they enabled. A remarkable collection of records, known as the Semna Dispatches, offers insight into the frequent patrols launched from Semna South, Semna, Kama, Urinardi, and Shalfak. These reports, sent to the local commander, reveal an atmosphere of intense vigilance, bordering on paranoia. Patrols routinely stopped and interrogated groups of Nubians, ensuring that anyone without a valid reason to be in Egyptian-held territory was turned back across the border. A typical report reads, "The patrol that set out to patrol the edge of the desert has returned and reported. We found the tracks of 32 men and 3 donkeys." Each dispatch concluded with a standardized reassurance: all matters within the king's domain, life, prosperity, health, are secure. This repetitive phrasing reflects an underlying anxiety, a strong desire to affirm that everything remained under control. The Egyptian government's strict stance was not an overreaction but rather consistent with the 12th Dynasty's deep-rooted preoccupation with order and security. In hindsight, their concerns about threats from Kush were entirely justified. Egypt's southern rival was affluent, militarily capable, and envious of Egyptian influence. To inspire unwavering loyalty among his troops, Senusret III commissioned a large stela within the fortress at Semna. It bore a message encouraging soldiers to defend Egypt's holdings. "To attack is brave, to retreat is disgraceful. Senusret also boasted of his brutal campaigns against the Nubians, claiming he had abducted women, seized their families, contaminated their wells, driven off livestock, destroyed barley, and set their crops ablaze. Such tactics reflected Egypt's ideal of total warfare. To further solidify his influence, the king had a statue of himself erected in a special shrine at Semna, intended to serve as a constant reminder of his presence and authority. The inscription declared, "My Majesty has caused an image of myself to be made at this frontier, so that you may stand firm for it, so that you may fight for it." This powerful combination of propaganda and force made resistance nearly impossible. Just one glance at a typical statue of Senusret III would have been enough to compel any soldier to fulfill his duty. Never before had an Egyptian ruler harnessed sculpture so powerfully to convey such an intimidating image of authority. The numerous statues of Senusret III create a deeply disturbing impression. His torso is always portrayed as tight, muscular, and vigorous. Yet it is the face that leaves a lasting impact: wide, intense eyes beneath heavy lids, hollow cheeks, and a stern, downturned mouth. This striking deviation from traditional royal portraiture is both captivating and ominous. His exaggerated ears further enhance the effect, symbolizing the ever-listening ruler. Anyone speaking unwisely risked harsh consequences. The 12th Dynasty's authoritarian regime remained intact for another 50 years after Senusret III's reign. His successor, Amenemhat III, 1818 to 1770 BC, adopted a harsher, more austere artistic style, blending it with archaic sculptural forms that emphasized the ancient legacy of kingship. His reign was marked by extraordinary achievements: vast reclamation and construction projects in the Fayum region, 2 pyramid complexes, the first plagued by structural cracks, and an increase in mining and quarrying missions to supply valuable materials for royal artisans. Culturally, his reign represented the zenith of the 12th Dynasty. With wealth from Nubian gold, Egypt's trade with the Near East thrived. Amenemhat III rewarded the loyal rulers of Kebni with generous gifts, and in return, these allies adopted Egyptian customs in an effort to mirror their influential patrons. Close diplomatic and economic ties were also maintained in the Sinai Peninsula, where local Palestinian leaders supported Egypt's mining efforts. This cooperation led to a shift from forced relocation of Asiatic slaves to peaceful immigration, particularly in the northeastern delta. Semitic-speaking migrants from Sinai, skilled in desert travel, became valuable additions to Egypt's paramilitary police, especially in the western desert. Their interaction with Egyptian military scribes resulted in the creation of a hybrid writing system for their language. However, the gradual growth of this Asiatic population in the Nile Valley and Delta would soon have far-reaching, and ultimately devastating, consequences. As Amenemhat III approached the end of his nearly 50-year reign, a crisis emerged. There was no young male heir to continue the royal line. In response, the aging king appointed an elderly relative as co-regent. Unfortunately, Amenemhat IV failed to leave a meaningful legacy during his 10 years of rule, possibly due to a lack of charisma, weakened political support, or simply old age. Eventually, he was succeeded by Sobenferu, the daughter of Amenemhat III. Her ascension marked a historic moment. Ancient Egyptian ideology had no place for the concept of a queen, making her reign a clear indicator that the dynasty was faltering. In an effort to solidify her legitimacy, Sobenferu emphasized her connection to her father, largely ignoring the ineffectual Amenemhat IV. She focused her building efforts at Hira, the site of her father's second pyramid complex. Yet after just 4 years on the throne, she, too, passed away. A dynasty that had begun with strength and vigor came to an end with barely a whisper. Lacking firm leadership, Egypt once again found itself vulnerable to the chaos and unrest that had long threatened it from within and beyond its borders. The ancient Egyptians harbored a deep-rooted sense of cultural superiority. They viewed themselves as a distinct and exceptional civilization, believing that their land was uniquely favored and shielded by natural barriers such as deserts and seas, which separated them from less fortunate neighbors. However, this image they projected was far from accurate. Located at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, Egypt was, in reality, a crossroads of people and cultures. From the earliest times, the fertile lands along the Nile and in the delta attracted migrants from surrounding arid and inhospitable regions to the west, east, and south. Each new wave of settlers brought with them skills, technologies, and traditions that would help reshape and revitalize Egyptian society. Occasionally, however, these newcomers arrived with motives beyond peaceful integration. Some carried aspirations of conquest along with their cultural contributions. While invasions were infrequent, Egypt was not invulnerable. When governed by a strong and centralized authority, such threats were often thwarted. But during times of political instability, particularly in the vulnerable northeast, the country became exposed to foreign ambitions. The decline of the Middle Kingdom's strength toward the end of one of its most prosperous periods opened the door to external threats. Egypt's determined focus on internal control and the defense of its frontiers had led its rulers to implement substantial measures to protect the northeastern delta. Unlike the fortified region of Semna in Nubia, where complete closure was achievable, Egypt's northeastern terrain made a total seal impossible. Nevertheless, a formidable defensive barrier known as the Walls of the Ruler, first established by Amenemhat I and reinforced by his heirs, was erected to discourage enemy advances. These fortifications were accompanied by regular patrols intended to observe, intercept, and regulate border crossings. At the center of these defenses stood Jaru, modern-day Tel el-Hebwa, a critical military stronghold that rivaled any fortress found in southern territories. Even with this fortified border, migration from the Near East continued. In fact, rather than being curtailed, the movement of people into the delta increased over time. Some of these newcomers were likely prisoners taken during Egyptian military campaigns. Others arrived legally, recruited by the state to contribute to mining expeditions in the Sinai, participate in large-scale building projects in the Fayum, or serve as scouts, trackers, and guards along Egypt's desert frontiers. By the close of this era, foreigners had become a noticeable presence in the population. Immigrants from the Near East not only integrated but also began to climb the social ladder, with some even attaining administrative roles. In the northeastern delta, where many had first settled, small clusters of foreign workers grew into sizable communities. These areas became magnets for further immigration, as people fleeing worsening conditions in their homelands sought refuge and opportunity among their already established kin in Egypt. One particular location became the focal point of this ongoing wave of newcomers. The town of Hutweret, located on the eastern bank of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, was originally founded as a modest border outpost by the Heracleopolitan dynasty. It was later re-established by Amenemhat I as part of his efforts to fortify Egypt's frontier. However, during the weakened reigns of his successors, Amenemhat IV and Sobenferu, the border monitoring system appears to have faltered, allowing a continuous flow of migrants to enter the country. After settling in Hutweret, these immigrants built homes in their own architectural style and preserved their cultural practices. But they were far from unfamiliar with Egyptian life. In fact, many were already well versed in Egyptian customs before arriving, indicating likely origins in places such as the Lebanese port of Kebni, which had long-standing political and cultural ties to Egypt. Some may have come from as far as Cyprus. Among them were Bedouin tribes from southern Palestine, drawn into the migration surge flooding into the Nile Delta. This convergence of different peoples, languages, and customs quickly transformed Hutweret into a uniquely diverse town, unlike any other in the region. Given that individuals of Asiatic descent had already held important positions elsewhere in Egypt, it's not surprising that the chances for social advancement in Hutweret were even greater. One notable official expressed his status in traditional Egyptian style by commissioning a large stone statue for his tomb chapel. However, he also made a point to highlight his foreign heritage. His portrait featured a large, red, mushroom-shaped hairstyle characteristic of immigrants from Kebni, and his skin was painted yellow, in line with the Egyptian artistic convention for portraying Asiatics. The curved throw stick he held served both as a symbol of his rank and a cultural marker, as it was also the hieroglyph for Asiatic. This individual clearly took pride in his heritage and displayed it openly in the face of Egyptian attitudes toward foreigners. Within just a generation, the Asiatic community in Hutweret had become secure in its distinct cultural identity, wealthy from Mediterranean trade, and increasingly assertive in local politics. A grand residence was constructed to serve as the governor's official quarters. It was, in essence, a palace with royal ambitions. Around it, senior officials were buried in elaborately decorated tombs, each one following Asiatic funerary traditions, such as the symbolic burial of 2 donkeys at the tomb's entrance. One such tomb belonged to a man who identified himself as the overseer of retinue, a title typically reserved for Egyptian officials managing relations with the region of Syria-Palestine. Another belonged to a chief steward and treasurer. Although these titles suggest the central administration still had a presence, it remains uncertain whether the leadership in Hutweret still regarded the king in Ijtai as their true authority. At the very least, the royal court appeared to be preoccupied with more pressing concerns elsewhere. After 200 years of rule by a single dynasty, the government found itself unprepared for the succession crisis that followed Sobekneferu's short reign. It seemed as though the ruling elite had forgotten how their ancestors had dealt with the end of a royal line. What followed was a rapid and chaotic rotation of kings, echoing the disorder that marked the close of the Old Kingdom. Rulers came and went with startling speed, some occupying the throne for only a few months as one contender after another laid claim to the crown. Over the span of about 150 years, Egypt saw roughly 50 different rulers in stark contrast to the mere 8 kings of the preceding 2 centuries. It appears that Egypt's most influential families, unable to agree on a single heir, adopted a system of rotating succession. Since senior members of each competing family likely held the most prestige, Egypt effectively became a nation ruled by the elderly, with aged kings ascending one after the other, each attempting to leave a legacy. Despite this distortion of traditional kingship, the central government continued to function with surprising efficiency. The real work of governance fell to high officials like viziers and treasurers, while kings, once central to all state affairs, became more ceremonial. Government records of the time still paid formal respect to royal authority, even though it was the officials who now decided who would become king, not the other way around. However, the broader population could not ignore the cracks forming in the monarchy. Common citizens stopped referring to the king or royal palace on their funerary monuments, likely realizing that invoking such unstable figures held little sway over their chances in the afterlife. Many kings didn't rule long enough to even secure their own burial arrangements. Pyramid construction came to a near halt, with several monarchs resorting to being buried in simple shaft tombs located within older pyramid complexes built by 12th Dynasty rulers. Expeditions to the mineral-rich Sinai Peninsula ceased entirely. The once glorious image of royal power faded, replaced by a monarchy struggling to project any sense of authority or permanence. The rise of Senusret III around 1680 BC highlighted just how much had changed in barely 50 years. Unlike many of his predecessors, Senusret made no attempt to conceal his humble origins. In fact, he celebrated them. Through inscriptions, he proudly acknowledged his common-born parents and openly recognized his non-royal family members, signaling a broader breakdown in the concept of divine kingship. His background in the military, including time served in the royal bodyguard, gave him insight into the inner workings of the court, which he used to his advantage. As king, he expanded the government by appointing more officials and revived construction efforts in an attempt to bring back some semblance of order. Still, these efforts were temporary fixes. The core of royal authority continued to weaken. Even the occasional resurgence of activity could not hide the fact that the monarchy's power was fading fast. The crisis was especially severe in Egypt's distant territories, particularly at the forts of occupied Wawat. A weakened administration no longer had the capacity to maintain the rotating military garrisons that had once protected these outposts during the height of the 12th Dynasty. One after another, the Egyptian government surrendered these Nubian strongholds, having lost the ability to enforce its authority beyond the traditional boundaries of the 2 lands. The last to be relinquished were the forts in the Semna Gorge, where the 13th Dynasty made a final, half-hearted attempt to uphold the frontier established by Senusret III. Eventually, even Semna itself was handed over to the local population as the last government representatives withdrew for good. With no more hope of regular supplies or support from the capital, some of the fortress communities began to consider an unthinkable option. Despite its past as Egypt's enemy, the kingdom of Kush offered something the Egyptian state no longer could: gold, and the ability to pay those willing to serve. A similar collapse unfolded in the northeastern delta. Patrols ceased, garrisons were called back, and Egypt's most exposed frontier was effectively abandoned. It wasn't long before a new figure stepped into the vacuum. A man named Nehazi assumed control of the forts and quickly proclaimed himself king of an independent delta realm, establishing his capital at Hutweret and directly challenging the legitimacy of the central government at Ijtai. Once in power, Nehazi followed the traditional patterns of Egyptian kingship. He preserved the existing administrative structure and aligned himself with his local patron god, Seth, the deity of Hutweret. A temple built in his honor at this time may have served to demonstrate his religious devotion. With oak trees lining its courtyard and its walls painted a striking blue, the Asiatic temple was among the largest of its kind in the Near East and symbolized the wealth and self-assurance of Nehazi's short-lived kingdom. However, despite its promising start, Nehazi's rule faced internal strife. Acts of deliberate destruction, such as the defacement of earlier burial statues, point to social unrest. The town also took on a militarized character, with soldiers interred alongside their weapons and the streets resonating with the clamor of metalworkers forging arms. In earlier periods, a rebellious province would have been swiftly and brutally brought back under control. But the government at Ijtai was in no condition to reclaim Hutweret through military force. Nehazi's secession was a devastating blow to the 13th Dynasty. It severed what little remained of Egypt's ties to the Near East and deprived the state of crucial trade revenue. The dynasty stumbled on, maintaining only the outward symbols of authority, but it was clear its power was hollow. It wasn't long before both the central government and the breakaway Delta Kingdom met their downfall, overwhelmed by a combination of natural calamities and human conflict. At Hutweret, famine and disease struck hard. Entire families were buried hastily, without the usual ceremonial care. The final years of the 13th Dynasty in the south also saw an unusually rapid succession of rulers, suggesting that the plague had reached them too. As sickness swept across Lower Egypt, the region became vulnerable to foreign invasion. From beyond the eastern border, a formidable army armed with advanced weaponry invaded the weakened land. They quickly seized Hutweret and continued southward, eventually capturing the historic capital of Memphis. Thus began the rise of the Hyksos. The Hyksos represented an unprecedented episode in ancient Egyptian history. For over 100 years, a Semitic-speaking elite from the coastal region of Lebanon held dominion over northern Egypt, and were acknowledged as rulers throughout much of the country. They reshaped their capital at Hutweret into a city deeply rooted in Asiatic culture, worshipped the foreign deity Baal, and observed burial practices unfamiliar to Egyptian tradition. Even their names marked them as outsiders. To future generations, their ascendancy symbolized the unraveling of the established order. Yet during their rule, the northeastern delta flourished. Economic activity surged thanks to thriving trade with the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Hutweret swelled to 2 or 3 times its previous size and emerged as the command center of a small empire that stretched into southern Palestine and along the Lebanese coastline. The fall of Memphis to the Hyksos was a devastating blow to the 13th Dynasty, both symbolically and strategically. Memphis stood as a powerful emblem of national unity, positioned at the vital crossroads between the Nile Valley and the Delta. Losing it forced the royal court to abandon Ijtai and retreat hurriedly to the south. So sudden was their flight that they left behind valuable temple and state archives, meaning future dynasties had to reconstruct religious texts from scratch, cut off from the accumulated wisdom of past generations. The displaced court re-established a makeshift government in Thebes, the traditional bastion of Egyptian autonomy. However, their authority had diminished drastically, now confined to the southernmost 7 nomes. In the interim, as the exiled leadership adjusted to their reduced domain, much of the central Nile Valley found itself without clear leadership. At Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, the absence of divine kingship was especially troubling. In response, local elites took the initiative and proclaimed a new ruling line. But lacking experienced craftsmen and trained administrators, these so-called kings of Abydos projected a diminished version of royalty. Their roughly made monuments stood in stark contrast to their lofty ambitions. It was a brave but ultimately unsuccessful effort to maintain Egypt's most sacred institution at one of its most revered religious sites. Within 2 decades, the fledgling dynasty at Abydos had vanished, leaving behind almost no trace. Farther south in Thebes, the refugees from Ijtai found relatively better fortune. To many in Upper Egypt, they remained the rightful rulers of the two lands. Loyal families who had once served the old regime continued to support the exiled court. But this impression of continuity was deceptive. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. Once a thriving city, blessed with royal attention and enriched through trade across Egypt and Nubia, Thebes was now cut off. The city was left diminished. Even the gods seemed to have turned away. Natural calamities deepened the nation's suffering. Less than 10 years after the evacuation of Ijtai, a severe flood struck Thebes, inundating the temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut, the spiritual heart of the region. In a gesture of leadership, the king chose to confront the crisis directly, wading into the submerged hall of the sanctuary to assess the damage, while his weary followers trailed behind him in silence. The next Egyptian ruler found himself confronting a devastating trio of crises: famine, flooding, and foreign invasion. Neferhotep III claimed credit for sustaining Thebes through the worst of the food shortages and for defending his city when it was submerged. Yet, when Hyksos' forces pushed southward, all he could do was attempt to bolster public morale, urging the people to face the enemy with courage. Highlighting his role as a military leader was a strategic move to inspire resistance, but titles like Guide of Mighty Thebes seemed more like wishful thinking than a reflection of real power. Across the land, from the throne to the common people, there was a growing dread that Thebes would suffer the same fate as Memphis. The most revealing record from this period is a stela erected at the temple of Ipitsut by King Mentuhotep I, a name that evoked traditional Theban authority, though its script betrayed a provincial flair. The inscription follows the customary Egyptian tone of exaggeration, with Mentuhotep I likening his troops to crocodiles on the flood. Yet his personal claims to power were telling. Referring to himself as king within Thebes, this my city, he appeared to acknowledge his limited influence. His self-description as one who acts as king was a far cry from the confident declarations of earlier monarchs. Nothing illustrated the collapse of Egyptian authority more clearly than the fate of the southern frontier. As the 13th dynasty declined, the government abandoned the Nubian fortresses, leaving their garrisons behind. In the absence of support, many of these Egyptians sought new livelihoods. The Kingdom of Kush, Egypt's longtime rival and a wealthy trading power in its own right, swiftly moved in. It absorbed the region of Wawat and seized control of the forts with barely any opposition. During the Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt, Egyptians living in Wawat adapted to the new regime, willingly serving their Nubian overlords. At Buhan, a man named Ka proudly declared himself a brave servant of the ruler of Kush. The local commander, Sopter, even took part in restoring the temple of Horus at Buhan, stating it was done to the satisfaction of the ruler of Kush. In dedicating his commemorative inscription, Sopter left no stone unturned. He invoked traditional Egyptian deities like Tasokar Osiris and Horus, the local god of Buhan, as well as the deified Senusret III, yet he also included the unnamed gods that are in Wawat. It was a cautious gesture, clearly meant to please multiple audiences. One can only imagine Senusret III, once the great defender of Egypt's southern border, turning in his grave. Now the roles had reversed. Egyptians, not Nubians, were the ones paying taxes on traded goods. They, not their southern neighbors, were being dictated to. The glorious days of the 12th Dynasty must have felt like a distant, fading legend. In stark contrast, the Hyksos kingdom was thriving. As more Asiatic immigrants settled in the eastern delta, existing communities expanded rapidly, giving rise to new settlements and associated cemeteries throughout the region. A significant fortified town was established at Tel El Yahudiyah, complementing the Hyksos' other defensive positions across the frontier zone. Confident in their control of the land, the Hyksos rulers fully embraced and showcased their unique cultural heritage. At Hutweret, altars burned continuously with offerings before the principal temple, dedicated to Baal-Zephon, whose cult had quickly merged with that of Seth, the Egyptian storm deity. Young children who passed away were buried according to Asiatic tradition in imported Palestinian amphorae, despite Egyptian versions being sturdier and more protective. In their economic practices, the Hyksos deliberately turned away from Egypt's traditional trade routes. They avoided commercial exchanges with Middle and Upper Egypt, choosing instead to trade extensively with Palestine and Cyprus. Goods like wine, olive oil, timber, and copper poured into the busy harbor at Hutweret, enriching the city and transforming it into one of the most prominent royal capitals in the Near East. To demonstrate their power and prosperity, the Hyksos constructed a grand citadel along the Nile. Built on reclaimed land, it spanned over 500,000 square feet and was protected by a massive curtain wall 25 feet thick, reinforced with buttresses. Inside, the royal palace was lavish and luxurious. Gardens and vineyards supplied fresh produce and provided shelter from the intense Egyptian heat, while a specially built, stone-lined channel brought clean water directly from the Nile into the palace grounds. Amid this wealth and security, the character of Hyksos rule began to shift. Earlier rulers had been satisfied with the title rulers of foreign lands, a label previously used during the Middle Kingdom to describe princes from the Near East. But with the rise of King Kian around 1610 BC, a new ambition emerged. At the height of Hyksos dominance, Kian sought recognition as a legitimate Egyptian pharaoh equal to his economic stature. He sent a diplomatic gift to the Minoan king of Knossos on Crete, signaling his entry onto the international stage. At home, Kian adopted a complete pharaonic titulary, beginning with the Horus name "He who embraces the banks of the Nile." This was as much a declaration of his political aims as it was symbolic. His intention was to extend Hyksos' control beyond the Delta and bring the whole of Egypt under his rule. A military campaign through Middle Egypt subdued the northern two-thirds of the country. It is even possible that the Hyksos forces captured Thebes briefly before retreating to their northern stronghold, destroying towns and temples along the way. Kian's successor, King Apipi, pushed this ambition further. He took the Horus name pacifier of the two lands, echoing the unifying rhetoric of Amenemhat I at the beginning of the 12th Dynasty. On one of his monuments, he referred to himself as beloved of Seth, Lord of Sumenu. By invoking the favor of a local Theban deity, Apipi was symbolically asserting his claim to rule all of Egypt. At that moment, the future of an independent Egyptian state looked more uncertain than ever. Despite numerous setbacks, the desire for Egyptian self-rule never completely faded. When the Hyksos forces withdrew from Upper Egypt and retreated to their stronghold in the Delta, it presented the Thebans with a faint but vital opportunity, a chance to rebuild and reorganize. Rahatep, the new ruler of Thebes and the first pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, took immediate steps to revive what had been lost. He initiated restoration efforts at sacred sites damaged by the Hyksos invasions. At Jebtu, he ordered the repair of the Temple of Min, lamenting that its gates and doors had fallen into ruin. Meanwhile, the religious center at Abydos saw the revival of the Osiris-Khenti-Amensu cult. These actions were not just about preserving ancient structures. By restoring temples and re-establishing traditional rites, Rahatep made it clear that he intended to rule as a legitimate Egyptian king, fulfilling the sacred duties expected of pharaohs. Rahatep's successors continued his mission. They repaired and expanded temples at Abydos and Jebtu, both historically significant cities during Egypt's earlier civil conflicts. However, the revival wasn't limited to religion. These locations also served as strategic points in military planning. Garrisons were stationed there, transforming them into advanced positions in preparation for renewed conflict with the Hyksos. Slowly, Thebes was laying the foundations for a political and military comeback. The kings who followed Rahatep also worked to revive another important royal tradition, pyramid construction. The modest rock-cut burial shafts of Neferhotep III and others had fallen far short of former royal standards. But the rulers of the 17th dynasty aspired to restore the grandeur of the Middle Kingdom. On the steep slope of Diyar Abu el-Naga, in western Thebes, they established a new royal cemetery. Among the tombs, that of Nubkepra-Intef, the dynasty's fourth king, stands out. His burial chamber was carved directly into the cliff, accessible by a descending shaft. But above ground, there was also a visible symbol of royal power. Though enclosed by a rather poorly built brick retaining wall, the pyramid itself was fashioned from mud bricks. The early Theban rulers lacked the resources to quarry large amounts of stone, so they settled for a more modest solution. The structure was plastered and whitewashed to imitate the appearance of a stone pyramid with smooth casing. At just 43 feet tall, Intef's pyramid could hardly compare to the towering monuments of the 12th dynasty. Nevertheless, the ambition was unmistakable, even if the means were limited. Similarly, Intef used a recycled statue reflecting the dynasty's resourcefulness during this period of revival. Although Nubkepra-Intef may not have possessed the wealth or resources of a great ruler, his determination was unmistakable. At his tomb, he erected obelisks that carried a bold and meaningful message. Through finely carved hieroglyphs, he linked himself with some of Egypt's most revered deities, Osiris Khenti-Amenchu, the god of Abydos and guardian of resurrection and the afterlife, Anubis, the jackal-headed god who oversaw embalming and burial rites, and somewhat unexpectedly, Sopta, the lord of foreign lands. Sopta's presence might seem out of place among these funerary gods, but it was far from accidental. Though a relatively minor deity, Sopta held important roles. He was considered the protector of foreign regions, particularly the rugged areas of Sinai and southern Palestine. His primary temple stood in Persoptu, right within the heart of the Hyksos-controlled eastern delta. This was a calculated religious maneuver. Just as the Hyksos king Kion had adopted the favor of Theban gods to legitimize his rule, Intef responded in kind by invoking a god rooted in Hyksos territory. By aligning himself with Soptu, the Theban kings sought divine backing in the political struggle to reclaim territories lost to the foreign rulers. However, divine favor alone would not be enough. For Nubkepra-Intef to rally support against the Hyksos, he first needed to strengthen his dynasty's position in Thebes. Unity was essential. Any internal division could prove disastrous. A vivid example of this internal consolidation survives in a royal decree issued at Jebtu. This document records the kings settling a dispute within the powerful priestly administration of the Temple of Min. Though the specifics of the conflict remain unknown, the king's ruling against an official named Minhotep was harsh and definitive. "Remove him from the temple of my father, Min, expel him from his office, now and for all future generations. Cast him down, and strip him of his provisions, so that his name is no longer remembered in this temple." It's likely that Minhotep's offense wasn't against the temple itself, but against supporters loyal to Intef's regime. This suspicion is reinforced by the identity of the man who benefited from Minhotep's removal, Amenemhat, the mayor of Jebtu and a steadfast ally of the 17th dynasty. Through such decisive actions, the Theban rulers gradually tightened their control over Upper Egypt, placing authority in the hands of those they could trust completely. The result was a tightly unified administration, eager to relearn and re-establish traditional systems of governance. Nubkepra-Intef's successor, Sobekemsaf II, around 1560 BC, demonstrated his commitment to this restoration effort by organizing a quarrying expedition to Wadi Hammamat. This marked the first state-backed mission of its kind in over 160 years. While the expedition involved just 130 men and may have been assembled somewhat hastily, it was nonetheless a significant beginning. Further east, in the mineral-rich region of Gebel Zait, mining operations resumed with the help of mercenaries recruited from the Medjay, a desert-dwelling people. These efforts not only sourced materials to revive royal workshops but also served as a sign that the Theban regime was expanding its reach, testing its strength, and preparing itself for future conflict. The clearest indication yet of looming military plans came when Sobekemsaf granted a land donation to the temple at Madu, modern Medamud, located just outside Thebes. This choice was deliberate. The deity honored Amenemhat II was Montu, the Theban war god who had once inspired the 11th dynasty in its campaign to reunify Egypt 6 centuries earlier. It was perhaps hoped that Montu's favor would again guide a new generation of Theban warriors in their quest for national redemption. Just as momentum was building, the 17th dynasty was struck by a sudden and devastating setback. From the remote regions of Nubia, a powerful army raised by the king of Kush advanced northward, passing through the Egyptian-built fortresses of Wawat. Their forces swept through Upper Egypt, attacking towns, looting temples, desecrating tombs, and plundering whatever they could seize. What made the invasion especially dangerous was that the Kushite forces had not come alone. The tribes of Wawat had been stirred to action, joined by other groups from Upper Nubia, the distant land of Punt, and the Medjay of the eastern desert, well known for offering their military skills to the highest bidder. This coalition posed a serious threat, uniting former subjugated peoples eager to strike back against Egyptian dominance. The town of Nekheb found itself at the heart of the conflict. Its residents, under the determined leadership of their local governor, mounted a fierce defense. They ultimately drove the attackers back beyond the first cataract. Still, the cost was steep. The governor lost personal property to the invaders, and the Theban forces suffered losses they could scarcely afford. This Kushite incursion came as a harsh surprise to the Theban leadership, but it delivered a critical lesson. Before they could pursue their campaign to reunify Egypt, they would first have to stabilize and defend their vulnerable southern frontier. In the Hyksos capital of Haweret, King Apipi likely sensed that open conflict was on the horizon. Taking no chances, he reinforced the defensive walls surrounding the royal citadel and forged a strategic alliance with the kingdom of Kush. Utilizing desert routes through the oases, he could communicate with the Kushite ruler without needing to pass through Theban-controlled areas. Apipi may have had to offer a share of the spoils to secure Kushite cooperation, but dividing Egypt between their two powers seemed a worthwhile price if it meant permanently ending native Egyptian sovereignty. Ironically, Apipi drew from an old Egyptian tactic to rally his people, a flood of propaganda. He boasted new, increasingly elaborate titles to emphasize his strength and legitimacy, declaring himself resolute in battle, bearing a greater name than any other king, guardian of distant lands unseen by his enemies. His ultimate claim was bold and unequivocal: there is none like him in any land. Unshaken by Apipi's rhetoric, the Theban king Senusret II responded not with words, but with action. Rather than trading declarations, he laid the groundwork for real battle. His first move was to establish a military headquarters from which to plan the offensive against Memphis and Hutweret. The site he chose was Deir el-Balas, on the Nile's west bank across from Jebtu. There he constructed a fortified palace for the royal household, supported by a large settlement and bakery complex for his entourage. A lookout post atop a nearby hill provided a sweeping view of the Nile Valley. With his command center in place, Senusret III initiated the first phase of the offensive against Hyksos forces. And he was no passive commander. Tall and powerfully built, with a large head crowned by thick, curly black hair, he cut the image of a warrior king. Inspired by his own sense of destiny, and strengthened by the fierce loyalty of his sister wife, Ahotep, he engaged the enemy directly in battle. Then tragedy struck. During the heat of combat, Ta was fatally wounded. Without protection, he was overwhelmed by attackers wielding axes, spears, and daggers. A blow from an Asiatic axe crushed his skull, killing him instantly. Amid the confusion, there was no time for proper burial preparations. His body was hurriedly embalmed and returned to Thebes. There, in front of a mourning royal family and a stunned citizenry, Ta the Brave, as inscribed on his coffin, was buried. His successor, Kamose, led the funeral procession. Senusret II had fallen in his prime, after a reign of barely 4 years. Now, the responsibility for Egypt's future rested on Kamose. Young and uncertain of his next steps, the new ruler convened a war council. With emotion and frustration, he voiced the gravity of the nation's plight. Why do I sit idle while one prince rules in Hutweret and another in Kush? I am forced to share Egypt with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each claiming a portion of my land. Never in the 14 centuries since the founding of Egypt's statehood had the country faced such humiliation. While periods of unrest and division had come before, this situation was unparalleled. With foreign rulers occupying both the northern and southern regions, the very survival of Egypt as an independent nation governed by Egyptians hung in the balance. Restoring the two lands would demand continued sacrifice, perseverance, and an unwavering determination to overcome all odds. The liberation of Egypt from Hyksos domination would come to be remembered by future generations as a defining moment of national revival. The monarchs who led the charge for independence would later be honored alongside legendary figures like Menes, the first pharaoh, and Mentuhotep, who reunited Egypt after a long civil war. Egyptologists share this perspective, viewing the removal of the Hyksos as the event that ushered in the New Kingdom, the most illustrious period in Egypt's ancient history. Yet, for those living through it, the experience was far less triumphant. Kamos's lament about the state of his realm was filled with genuine frustration. By 1541 BC, Egypt occupied only a fraction of the territory once ruled by the mighty kings of the 12th Dynasty. For many Egyptians, even those in the Theban stronghold, the existing arrangement didn't seem entirely unfavorable. Cooperation with the Hyksos regime at Hutweret brought tangible benefits. The Thebans were allowed to farm and graze animals on land under Hyksos authority, and in return for paying taxes, they even received fodder and other provisions. Kamos's own officials reportedly told him they were content with this arrangement. While this could have been part of a propagandistic narrative crafted to highlight the king's courage in contrast to the supposed timidity of his advisors, there is likely some truth behind it. The Hyksos had introduced new technologies to Egypt, facilitated expansive Mediterranean trade, and managed the country with administrative skill equal to that of native rulers. A strategy of peaceful coexistence might have seemed the easiest path forward. But such a path held no appeal for Kamos or the 17th dynasty, who sought to restore Egypt's former greatness. For a proud Theban, the presence of foreign rulers on Egyptian soil was intolerable. Kamos made his intentions unequivocally clear to his inner circle: "My desire is to reclaim Egypt." Yet before that vision could be realized, Egypt had to contend with two pressing challenges: the lingering Hyksos occupation and the rising threat from Kush. The Kushite ruler had built a powerful army, complete with a strong cavalry, and showed every intent to expand his territory. The earlier raids on Nekheb had taught the Thebans a critical lesson: they needed to secure their southern border before launching any offensive in the north. Facing a numerically superior Hyksos army equipped with better technology, Egypt could not afford to fight on two fronts. The Kushite danger had to be addressed first. Thus, in 1540 BC, in only the second year of his reign and following extensive preparations, Kamos led his troops south. Their mission was clear: retake Wawat and shield it from further incursions, creating a secure buffer zone to the south. As the army advanced through the lightly populated Nile Valley beyond Abu, they met little, if any, resistance. When they reached the base of the Second Cataract, their target came into sight: the fortress of Buhan. Once a vital military hub during the Middle Kingdom, Buhan had easily fallen into Kushite hands in the intervening years. Its Egyptian garrison had quickly adapted, serving their new Nubian rulers as faithfully as they had served previous pharaohs. However, upon seeing Kamos's army approach in force, the occupants of the fort seemed to change allegiance once again without mounting a defense. Greeted as a liberator, Kamos took charge of reinforcing Buhan's defenses and restoring it as a key southern stronghold. As a capable strategist, Kamos's foresight extended beyond the immediate task of defense. With an eye on Egypt's long-term presence in Nubia, he took steps to re-establish centralized control in the region. Relying on the uncertain loyalty of fortress commanders was a risk no wise king would take. Instead, Kamos introduced a new system of governance that would shape Egypt's administration of Nubia for centuries. He appointed a trusted official named Teti as the first king's son of Kush, a viceroy who would represent the pharaoh in all Nubian affairs and report directly to him. With Teti securely positioned at the administrative center in Pharaohs, Kamos returned north to prepare for a much more dangerous confrontation. His approach to the northern front combined psychological warfare with military action. Chamos believed that a campaign of fear and destruction targeting Hyksos-aligned towns in Middle Egypt would shake enemy morale and pave the way for a final offensive. As he declared, "I sailed downstream as a victor to expel the Asiatics, following the will of Ammonius, my courageous army before me, like a storm of fire." His first objective was the town of Nefrusi, situated within Hyksos-controlled territory just north of Kmun, modern El Ashmunian. The town was under the governance of an Egyptian named Teti, son of Pepi. By striking hard and publicly punishing this collaborator, Chamos hoped to send a clear message that would encourage others to defect to the Egyptian side. Under the cover of night, Chamos' forces advanced and launched a dawn assault. I descended upon him like a hawk. My troops were like lions carrying off their prey. The attack was merciless. After plundering the town, Chamos ordered it to be completely destroyed. In the following days, the settlements of Hardai and Prashak met a similar fate. With numerous towns in Middle Egypt reduced to rubble, Hyksos' dominance in the region was shattered. Thebes was advancing, both in territory and momentum. Then, by chance, a valuable opportunity presented itself. Drawing on Thebes' deep familiarity with desert terrain, developed during earlier conflicts, Chamos maintained regular patrols along the desert routes. These surveillance units monitored activity, watching for suspicious movements and gathering intelligence. The Hyksos, too, depended on these routes for trade with Kush. Though Thebes was officially under Hyksos control, sending goods through rebel territory along the Nile was too great a risk. Instead, the route between Seko, modern Elkes, and Kerma, the Kushite capital, ran through the western desert oases and was heavily traveled by caravans and diplomatic envoys. One such envoy was intercepted by Chamos scouts near the oasis of Jesjes, modern Bahariya. To their astonishment, the messenger was found carrying a letter from the Hyksos ruler to the new king of Kush. Its contents were staggering. From the ruler of Hutweret, Usera Apipi, greetings to the son of the king of Kush. Why have you taken the throne without notifying me? Have you seen what Egypt has done to me? The king there, Chamos, has invaded my territory without provocation, attacking both my lands and yours. He has ravaged them both. Come north, do not hesitate. He is within my reach. No one in Egypt will resist you. I will not allow him to pass until you arrive. Then, we shall divide the cities of Egypt between us. Despite expressing frustration over not being informed of the Kushite succession, Apipi extended a bold proposal to his southern ally. If the Kushites joined him in a military campaign, he would share control of Egypt. It was a textbook case of divide and conquer. For the Thebans, the intercepted letter confirmed their greatest fear. Chamos reacted swiftly and instinctively. Rather than executing the unlucky messenger, he chose to send him back to Hutweret with a message of his own directed at Apipi. I will not leave you in peace. I will not allow you to walk the earth without my pursuit. To reinforce this threat, Chamos ordered the messenger to report the recent Theban victories in Middle Egypt, highlighting not only the bravery and resolve of his army but their ability to strike deep into Hyksos-controlled territory. Apipi's appeal for Kushite assistance had exposed a critical vulnerability. Suddenly, the idea of a Theban offensive against Hutweret itself no longer seemed far-fetched. If Chamos' first-hand account of the campaign is to be trusted, he did in fact press his attack all the way to the Hyksos capital. He boasted of reaching the outskirts of Hutweret, indulging in wine from Apipi's vineyards, felling his trees, violating his women, and seizing cargo ships filled with luxury goods imported from the Near East: gold, lapis lazuli, silver, turquoise, countless bronze axes, morina oil, incense, fat, honey, willow, and boxwood. He claimed he had approached close enough to see the royal fortress where Hyksos women, terrified, peered over the walls like baby mice hiding in their holes. Chamos organized his navy into formation and launched a bold assault on the Hyksos stronghold. However, the attack did not succeed. Despite the setback, Chamos returned to Thebes presenting himself as a triumphant warrior, leading his army home in victory. True to pharaonic tradition, He commissioned a series of monumental stelae to be erected in the temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut, proclaiming his military feats to future generations. But the celebrations were cut short by his sudden death just a few months later, in 1539. The exact cause remains unknown. Despite his courage and determination, Hyksos did not receive the burial of a triumphant hero. He was laid to rest in a simple, unadorned coffin, accompanied only by 2 daggers. Hyksos' passing was a heavy blow to Egypt. The sense of grief was likely compounded by uncertainty surrounding the royal succession. Only 3 years earlier, Hyksos had probably been chosen over the rightful heir because he was old enough to continue the fight that had taken the life of Senusret I. With Hyksos now gone, the throne could no longer bypass the designated successor. Egypt entered a period of uneasy waiting. 10 long years passed as Thebes prepared for the young Prince Ahmose to reach maturity. During this time, Egypt maintained control over Buhan, keeping the Kushite threat in check. Meanwhile, Apipi's weakened forces were in no condition to strike. But without a leader of their own, the Thebans could not take the initiative either. All they could do was hold their position and prepare for the battles yet to come.